Good afternoon. Good morning elsewhere. And welcome to the very first Contact Live webinar of 2021. My name's Clive Snell. I'm the MD of Contact Live. It is my pleasure, simple task, to introduce Ian Singh, who is a principal consultant at CCC, the Copyright Clearance Centre. And Ian is going to answer the question, how can publishers use knowledge graphs to overcome their data management challenges? For this event, we're using Zoom webinar. That means that your mics are automatically muted, but we would really like you to file your questions on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Ian is going to talk for 20 minutes or so. He has a presentation that lasts that long. Then I'm going to come back together with Ian. We'll go through a Q&A, and we're looking to conclude this event by around 5 p.m. GMT sharp. That's it. Welcome, Ian. All I need to do now is say over to you.
Thank you very much, Clive. So as Clive said, what we're going to do today is talk largely about knowledge graphs and how in a publishing context can these be used to overcome some challenges, both from data management, but also from a real-world business perspective. So just to set out, what do we mean by a knowledge graph? Now, if you play word association, and who doesn't like doing that, most people, when they think of knowledge graphs, will think of really complicated diagrams with nodes and edges and that sort of thing. And hand on heart, I'm going to confess, over the course of the next 20 minutes, there will be some pictures of blobs and lines or nodes and edges. But for us, it's more than that. A knowledge graph is an output from a knowledge system. And by that, we mean something which takes data and transforms that first into information by establishing some relationships, and then turns it into knowledge or intelligence. Think back to the 70s definition of intelligence, and that it's actionable information that's of use to a decision maker. So really, it's this transformation with a bit of confidence in the system to take data and transform that into something that people can use to support decisions and take action. So what's CCC's interest in this? Well, going back a period of years, we've had a research project looking at how do we take the flat bibliographic data that we're really familiar with from our rights business and turn this into linked data and make it something more actionable and interesting. And that's been ongoing. And then, surprise, surprise, no prizes for guessing in 2020, what provided a focus for applying this research. We suddenly thought that in a context where publishers were making vast amounts of information available to researchers to accelerate the process of researching COVID-19, this presented us with an opportunity to test and see if the lab's work had really gone and had an effect. So what we did is we decided that, okay, we'll put in place a knowledge graph processing pipeline whereby we bring some content in. So we look at this material that the publishers have made freely available and bring it into our system and refine it so that we're confident it's related to COVID. Do things like disambiguate authors, and this was a big issue which we could run a session on all by ourselves. Then enrich it, so add applicable metadata that provides context for the content, and finally visualize it to create that a diagram that we'll see in a bit. So essentially what we did is we ran a search across an array of COVID-19 and related diseases. And we took it from data sets such as COVID-19 and lit COVID, and also some other CCBY content that we had in our XML for mining data set. We applied an ontology, in this case, National Institutes of Health Medical Subject Headings, or MESH. And out of that, we got in the region of 137,000 articles by 500,000 authors, which produced something a little bit like this, which is the typical representation of a knowledge graph. Here, it's representing the 361 most prolific authors in our data set, where the nodes represent authors, and the size of the node represents how prolific they are, and the lines or edges represent collaborations. And again, the weight there is represents the significance of that collaboration. So, having done this and applied it in a technological sort of way, we then start to think, well, how could this be useful to the publishing community? So we suddenly thought that as part of the response to COVID, there is a massive uptick in the amount of research being pushed through. And a nice example of that, late last year, there was an article in The Atlantic, which pointed out that in the months to September, the New England Journal of Medicine had received about 19,000 submissions. In context, across the whole of 2019, they only had about 16,000. So there's a huge uptick in the amount of research being produced. And that's not just article submissions, but preprints, posters, presentations. There's a lot out there. And in terms of the response to COVID, with research wanting to try and proceed through the process as quickly as at all possible, we thought maybe there was a peer review challenge, and maybe we could help publishers work with that. So we made this system available to our publishing clients just as a free service, an add-on to what they got in 2020, and gave it to them to make use of it as they saw fit, thinking that if you think about peer review, and maybe if we're looking for a suitable reviewer for antigens and immunologic techniques, for example, this might help. So if we look at highlighting authors active in immunologic techniques in the graph, we can see these sorts of the continent of this topic being made clear. It starts to give us an idea of who candidate experts in this field might be. We can then overlay antigens over the top of it, and we can then see that there are areas of overlap where we might want to focus. There are also areas of outliers. That doesn't disqualify someone from being a reviewer, but it provides you with a bit of context, and again, a bit more information to think about how you might make a decision. But let's focus on areas of overlap. So here we can see that this author, Luis and Juanes, has published on both immunologic techniques and antigens. We can see from the size of his node that he's reasonably prolific, and we can see by the number of outgoing edges that he's collaborated reasonably substantially. So he might be a good candidate for selection as a reviewer. We can also drill into what he's actually published. We can see he's published 61 articles in this data set, but actually we can see that the high point of his output was really over 20 years ago, which again, doesn't disqualify him from being a reviewer, but it's a piece of context that allows you to think about things. We can then go and look in more detail about what he has published, and here we start to introduce new concepts such as the individual articles and the journals that he has worked on in addition to the collaborations. And then we can zoom in on a particular article. So essentially allowing us to go from the general, the world of COVID-19, to a particular article that is about a COVID-19 response. And of course, you can go and link straight out to that article as well, should you have the rights to it. Again, giving you the ability to make a decision about whether you want to select him as a reviewer. And as you go through it, you can also then go and add things to an individual notebook. So for example, here we've added Juanes to our notebook, which provides us with a customized, personalized view of the world. And as those of you I've talked to previously will be really aware that one of the things I always stress is everybody's view of the world is going to be different. So providing you with the ability to create a graph of your own is something that's actually really important to us. And here we can see that of these authors that we're interested in, they're connected through work on animals, and they neither of them have published in microbiology and immunology. Again, giving you this additional level of context. We can also go and take a wider view of what the constellation of knowledge about COVID is using the graph. So if we look at how the graph functions, we can see there are areas of significant collaboration, there are outliers, and just to take an example, if we look up at the top right of the graph, we can see that there is a particular area of collaboration here. You've got 5 authors who are clearly really working closely together. You can see they're quite prolific, and by the strength and weight of the edges, they're really collaborating a lot. And if we overlay the medical subject headings, we can see that this is a real area of strength of research on dog diseases as relate to COVID-19. Now, if I wanted to go and find a way into that, if I wanted to go and say, capitalize on the work of Gabriella Elia, how would I get in there? Well, I can see that this research community is connected out to the wider world through Nicola De Caro. She's got a connection to Edward Holmes. And if we go and look at the connection, we can see that Nicola has collaborated with Edward on 2 articles. We can represent that. And we can see that they're connected through feline parvoviruses, for example. So if we wanted to go and access this expertise on dog diseases and COVID, a route to that comes to us through cat diseases. So cats linked to dogs. I quite like that this is borne out in our knowledge graph, as well as sort of in popular culture and in real life. So what did we do? As I said, we made this available to publishers over the course of 2020. And we sat down with them and talked to them and allowed them to use it. And the really, really interesting thing about this, and we had lots of conversations, and we approached it saying, you could use this to solve your peer review problem. And they turned around, and I would say the maximum maybe 15% of cases, they said, yes, peer review is what they'd use this for. The rest of them said, you know what, we're fine on peer review. And actually, we probably wouldn't use this to solve that particular problem. Now, is this bad news for us at CCC? Does this invalidate our research work? And the answer is no, it doesn't. I think this is really good news on a number of levels. First of all, it shows that the systems that have been put in place for peer review by publishers across the decades are sufficiently robust to be able to stand up to the challenge of this uptick in research related to COVID. So from a purely altruistic human perspective, I'm pleased about that. It's probably why we've got vaccines. But equally, it's not bad news for CCC's research, because actually they didn't say, we won't use this for peer review, we're not interested. What they said is, we probably won't use this for peer review. we'll use it for something else, and we do use it for something else. And pretty much every conversation that we had flagged up something new and exciting that they wanted to do. So for example, saying, could we track funding information? So we can see who's actually paying for research in the era of open access. Can we look at geographic location? One publisher in particular said, after the murder of George Floyd, said, well, actually, we want to think about, are we doing more than paying lip service to diversity and inclusion? So can we look and see, are we publishing authors from the global south? So can we map this? And that led on to actually an interesting discussion where they said the output of that probably shouldn't be a typical knowledge graph. Maybe a map would be a better way of representing that linked data. But equally, people would say, well, this is a really good way of spotting the really established prolific authors like Luis and Juanes that we looked at, been around for decades. But actually what we might want to find are the rising stars. Can we go and find authors who haven't published very much, but are maybe the postgrad students of the influential authors of today? Could we use those? Because maybe they've got a really new insight into things. And the really encouraging thing about this is I initially had, and much, much more on this slide, and then marketing thankfully told me that was tragic. But it's true. Every conversation that we had led to people saying, we think we could do this, and that would be something new. And we'd take it down and think, that's a really interesting approach. How could we make that work? So for us, the whole experience of rolling knowledge graphs out over 2020 and into 2021 has been really encouraging. Because, from my perspective, linked data and visualizations aren't anything particularly new. Showing my age, I can remember back in the early 2000s, working for a B2B publisher and using tools like Insight StarTree to go and say, okay, we can draw these relationships, but what does it do? And the answer was, well, we didn't go very far because we were approaching it from technology perspective. And a lot of projects fail when they're technology led because they don't have the business focus. You can't bring them back to convincing a board as to why they should invest in it just for technology's sake. But if you ask people the business questions, it starts to become more interesting. You start to get buy-in from the providers of information to see the value in linked data, and they're now much more interested in providing the linked data. And that's really good news, because from a CCC perspective, we think we can do a lot more with linked data, not just visualizing things in knowledge graphs. And also, we can go and make meaningful contributions to publishers by allowing them and empowering them to use knowledge graphs to address the sort of business challenges that they have. So I think there's considerable grounds for optimism in terms of taking knowledge graphs and applying them in the sort of publishing partnerships that we have with publishing companies, big and small. So I'm excited about what the future holds. I'm hoping that this whistle-stop tour of what CCC has done in the field of knowledge graphs has been of interest. And then over the next 10 minutes, hopefully we can have a useful series of questions and answers. So let's go over to you. And Clive, hopefully we've got a bit of interest in the chat.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. That was really, really good, actually. Very, very useful. I think it's fascinating. We've had a lot of knowledge graph discussion in the content community, and it just keeps getting, it's almost like peeling back the skin of an onion. You get more and more interesting stuff. We have a few questions. The first one from Kaveh Bazagan, and that reads, what challenges did you have in disambiguation? Did all authors have ORCIDs?
Okay, as I said, we could have spent comfortably a half-hour session and longer on disambiguation.
Yeah.
So the short answer is no, not all the authors had ORCIDs. I wish they had. They just plain don't. So we came up with basically a 16-stage process for disambiguation, which involved things such as ORCID is one of them. but also things such as time series. So, is there a significant gap in terms of when they've published? So someone who published really prolifically in the 1980s, then had nothing really until the 2000s, but happens to have the same name, probably a different person. Similarly, applying mesh terms. If they're in a radically different field, there's the probability that they're different people. Not a guarantee. And because we're doing this in a machine-assisted algorithmic way, you'll never get to 100%. Our tech people say they're confident they're at about 80%, 90% is achievable, 100% is not. And when we use it, you can readily find outliers. So with the example we had, there are other instances of Lewis and Juanes in our data set, different nodes. I think they're the same person. What we do is we basically spot that, feed that back in development, and just iterate the algorithm.
So kind of not really, but you've got ways around that you feel confident in the outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic case of best is the enemy of good enough. It gets you towards that.
Yeah, so that's good enough. Okay, great answer. Thank you. I don't know if Kaveh will come back on that. I've marked it as answered for the time being. The question that strikes me is we've talked a lot about knowledge graphs relating to COVID in this presentation, which makes a huge amount of sense, especially right now. So hence there's a focus on the medical side of publishing, but how can knowledge graphs fix problems for publishers in other spaces?
Well, I think the challenges are very similar. You want to find rising stars, you want to see what your publishing profile looks like. So it depends a lot on the sort of vocabularies that you have. So here we used mesh. We've also used other chemical styled vocabularies to try and approach them from a different perspective. But interestingly, a couple of the publishers that we talked to in the context said, mesh is great and the medical side of it is great, but we're actually okay with that. We understand that side of things. But what could we do looking at COVID in the round? Because a large part of fixing this problem is socioeconomic, what demographic groups are impacted, that kind of thing. So there we started to look at what other ontologies are available and how can you go and apply things. So it's taking one or ideally more ontologies to go and craft something that's really relevant to that publisher's knowledge domain and starting to apply that. Medical at STEM is easier because there's been a lot of focus on that, but there are some really exciting things in some of the other areas as well.
So you think this is really going to be very, very sort of cross-market and applies Absolutely. In many, many contexts going forwards. Interesting. Let's go beyond publishing, looking beyond publishing in the wider context of content and knowledge, the content knowledge space. How are these approaches applicable, therefore, in other industries?
Well, we're in a happy situation of having clients from more than publishing. We've got a large array of corporate clients in particularly pharmaceutical and chemical spaces, and we've showed it to them as well. And the interesting thing is there's a huge level of interest. Some of the problems are very, very similar because I have a theory that everybody is a publisher, they just don't necessarily know it yet. Pharmaceutical companies want to find key opinion leaders to help them manage clinical trials. That's a lot of finding an author. But equally, they go and look at things and say, well, I might want to go and find how my products are being received in the market and overlay that with what's being published. So use it for pharmacovigilance, for example. Are there adverse effects being reported? Can we overlay sentiment analysis onto this sort of thing? Can I overlay commercial information? Can I fuse bibliographic data with my own internal financial data and somehow go and see if that goes and draws out some actual real-world financial business efficiency pictures for us. So a lot of interest. I think it's really encouraging. I think there's many more questions. I think there's much more of a challenge in terms of finding the right data set, but sure, really exciting.
I mean, personally, I think the fintech space is probably a very interesting one from the perspective of exactly what you've just described. Very, very different, but trying to create a footprint and do things in a somewhat different way from a very traditional set of banks, for example. So I can see it applying there, and I think we have seen some examples in the past of knowledge graphs working in those sort of financial arenas. So yeah, thank you. I'm just going to hit you with one more before we wind up. Throughout the presentation, throughout the conversation, you can see how linking data in this smart way could benefit all sorts of organizations, companies like ours and so on. But where do you start?
Good question. And, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. But I think there's three key things here. The first is, what data do you want to go and bring into this, and how do you want to transform this into knowledge? So what does your data look like? Are there gaps? How do you fill those gaps? How do you mitigate those gaps? How do you normalize that data? Secondly, what sort of enrichment do you want to do? So what relationships do you want to establish? What ontologies do you want to apply? Do those ontologies exist? Do those vocabularies exist? Or do we need to go and craft something around this? And finally, how do you want to represent that information? So linked data can go and be presented in lots and lots of different ways, not just the sort of the balls and lines that we looked at. So from the periodic table of visualizations, what makes most sense? So the first step is talk to us. Let's have a conversation about the data. Let's have a conversation about the enrichment, and let's have a conversation about the presentation, and really focus on getting it right in terms of answering the business problems, rather than just creating knowledge for knowledge's own sake.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. Thanks very much. It was a really, really interesting. I'm sure we're still very much at the beginning of the journey for knowledge graphs in the context of certainly the content community. I think it's going to be a very, very important issue going forward. Thank you to that. We have got, as I think, Ian, do you want to put up your last slide before
absolutely.
Wind up completely? So the next thing I was going to say is on the 19th of May. We've got a few dates for you. 19th of May, we have our next Contact Live webinar supported by CCC. And we go there's some words as to what that involves, and we will announce that more fully very soon. A couple of other dates for your diary. The 15th of June, we have the Contact Forum returning for the third time, which is our one-day event follow-up from Contact from last November. And that's going to be an online-only event. And we will be announcing the program for that in the next couple of weeks. Really excited to say we're starting to plan a hybrid blended Contact 2021. So that's going to be in person, face-to-face in London and online on the 16th and 17th of November 2021. That one is something we've not done before, so we're very excited about it. Please do get in touch with us if you'd like to get involved. Final thanks to Ian. Fantastic presentation. Thanks for addressing the questions in such a positive and interesting way. The whole thing's been on video. We will launch the video. We'll get the video up on our website for you to view as soon as we possibly can, certainly in the next 24 hours or so. We're also going to follow up with everyone, with you tomorrow, sending you an email if you're interested in following up specific things around knowledge graphs and so on. That's all from me. That's all from Ian. Thanks once again. all I've got to say now is enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you all next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.